They rejected her with smiles. Not the honest cruelty of rage. No, that would have been easier to understand. They rejected her the way people throw away something damaged, with polite faces, with soft voices, with the unspoken certainty that she wasn't worth the trouble. The moon assembly of Ashenfell Pack had begun like it always did, torches burning along the cliffside hall, snow drifting in through the high arches. The pack gathered in their ranks as if the world would remain exactly as it had been yesterday. Warriors in front, betas behind, omegas to the side like shadows that were allowed to exist only if they stayed quiet. Myra stood among those shadows, head lowered, hands clasped in front of her to hide the tremble in her fingers. She knew why they had called her here. The elders didn't waste assembly nights on omegas unless they planned to make an example. Myra of Ashenfell, Elder Soren announced, voice carrying across the hall. Step forward. The words hit her like cold water. Myra's throat tightened, but she obeyed, stepping onto the center stone where the moonlight fell brightest. Every gaze followed her, heavy and sharp. Some held disdain, some held pity, most held something worse, boredom, like they had already decided how this story ended. She was small, too small for the role fate had tried to hand her. Her cloak was worn at the edges, patched and repatched. Her hair was dark and long, braided tight to keep it from falling into her face when she worked. Her eyes, gray-blue, never stayed on anyone's for long. A weak Omega. That was what they called her. Not because she cried. Myra had learned years ago that tears only entertained them. Not because she begged, she never begged. They called her weak because she didn't fight back. Because she didn't shift. Because her wolf was silent. Because she had been born without the roar the pack worshipped. At the front of the hall, Alpha King Darius Stoneclaw sat on the raised dais, his posture relaxed, one elbow resting on the arm of the stone throne as if this was a minor inconvenience. A king carved from dominance, broad shoulders, battle scars at his throat, golden eyes that didn't warm for anyone. Myra felt those eyes on her now. Cold, measuring. Unimpressed. This assembly, Elder Soren continued, is called for one reason. Myra has failed to strengthen the pack. Murmurs rose, quiet, poisonous. She can't even shift. She's been here since childhood and still. Dead weight. Myra's stomach twisted. She kept her face blank. She had learned how. Darius didn't speak at first. He watched the elders do the cutting for him. When he finally moved, the hall fell silent instantly, as if his presence alone was a command. You were brought to Ashenfell as a child, Darius said. His voice was calm, too calm. An orphan from the borderlands, we fed you, sheltered you, gave you a place. Myra swallowed hard, forcing her breathing to stay steady. And in return, Darius continued, you have given us nothing. The word nothing hung in the air like smoke. Myra's hands clenched beneath her cloak. She had given them everything, just not the kind of things they valued. I work, she said quietly before she could stop herself. Her voice was soft, but it carried in the silence. I heal the sick, I. A laugh cut her off. Not one person, many. A wave of amusement rolled through the warriors. Heal, someone scoffed. She mixes herbs and thinks that's strength. Anyone can boil leaves. Heat rose behind Myra's eyes, but she blinked it back. If she cried here, they would call it proof. Darius stood. He stepped down from the dais, boots striking stone with slow, deliberate force. Every step felt like a countdown Myra couldn't escape. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell winter on him, iron and pine and dominance. You are weak, Darius said, not loudly but with absolute certainty. And weakness is a disease, it spreads, it makes others soft. Myra's heart hammered. I am not trying to infect anyone, she whispered. His lips barely moved when he answered, you don't have to try. The crowd shifted, anticipating. Elder Soren lifted his staff slightly. Alpha King, shall we proceed? Darius held Myra's gaze for the first time. And something flickered behind her ribs. An instinct, a warning, a memory she kept buried so deep she almost forgot it existed. The secret. The thing she had been hiding since childhood. Not because she wanted power. Because power always came with chains. Myra's fingers brushed unconsciously over the inside of her wrist beneath her sleeve. A faint raised shape lay there, hidden beneath cloth, hidden beneath scars, hidden beneath years of careful silence. A mark, not the pack's mark, not the mate bond. Something older, something the elders would recognize if they saw it. Something that would make them stop calling her weak and start calling her dangerous. Darius's gaze dropped for a heartbeat, as if he sensed something he couldn't name. Then he hardened again. "I reject her presence in this pack," Darius declared. The hall erupted, gasps, whispers, the sharp thrill of judgment. Myra's breath caught painfully, though no bond snapped. This rejection wasn't mystical, it was worse. It was chosen. "Effective immediately," Darius said, voice echoing off stone. "Myra is stripped of Ashenfell protection. She is to be cast beyond our borders before nightfall." Myra stood perfectly still. Inside her chest, her silent wolf curled tighter as if bracing. The elders nodded as if this was logical. The warriors looked satisfied. The Omegas looked away. And Myra felt the secret under her skin pulse once, faintly, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. As guards approached, Myra lifted her chin. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She only whispered, so softly that no one but the moon could hear. "You should have let me stay weak. Because if they forced her into the forest tonight, the thing she was hiding would finally stop hiding back." The gates of Ashenfell closed behind Myra, with the kind of finality that didn't need sound to hurt. Still, they gave her sound anyway. Iron slammed into iron, echoing across the mountainside, the noise swallowed by the rising wind almost instantly. Snow rushed in from the open night like it had been waiting for permission, coating the ground at her feet before she could take a second breath. Myra stood there just outside the pack's borders, the glow of torchlight already fading behind the towering walls. The warmth that had defined home only moments before vanished so quickly it felt like it had never existed. Her cloak was too thin. They had always given her the leftovers, old cloth, cracked boots, threadbare wool. It had never mattered when she worked by fires or in warm dens. Now it mattered with terrifying clarity. She took a step away from the gates. Her boots sank into snow that came halfway to her calves. The cold sliced straight through leather and skin, a clean, biting pain that made her hiss despite herself. Weak, she reminded herself bitterly, that's what they think you are. The wind howled between the trees, bending the branches until they creaked like bones under pressure. The forest beyond Ashenfell's borders was a different world, ancient, untamed, unclaimed. Wolves avoided it when they could. No pack ruled here. And now it ruled her. Myra walked because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant dying in the shape the pack had chosen for her. She pushed forward blindly, following no trail, only instinct and stubborn refusal to fall in sight of those walls. Snow plastered her hair to her cheeks, melting, refreezing, stinging her skin raw. Her fingers went numb first, then her toes. Then the pain dulled into something worse, absence. Her wrist burned. Not from cold. From beneath her sleeve, the hidden mark began to throb, slow and steady, a heat completely out of place in the frozen world around her. Myra sucked in a sharp breath, yanking her arm closer to her chest. "Not now," she whispered desperately. "Please, not now." She had learned as a child that the mark reacted to fear, to abandonment, to being unwanted, which was why she had spent her life avoiding those things, keeping quiet, staying small, letting the pack believe whatever made them comfortable. The storm didn't care about comfort. She stumbled as the ground sloped downward, losing her footing and crashing into a drift. Snow filled her mouth, her nose, choking her until she fought her way up with numb hands. The forest swallowed her sound. No one was coming. That truth settled heavily. Her wrist pulsed hotter. Myra ripped the cloth away with shaking fingers, exposing the inside of her arm to the moonlight for the first time in years. The mark glowed faintly. Not the silver of a bond, not the blue of magic. It was a deep, warm gold, etched in lines that didn't belong to any alphabet she knew, curving shapes that seemed to shift when she stared too long. The same mark she'd woken with one night when she was 5, abandoned at the borderlands, with no memory of how she'd survived the storm that killed everyone else in her caravan. the same mark the healer had gone pale upon seeing, before Myra hid it forever. "You were supposed to stay quiet," Myra whispered to it. "I kept you hidden." The mark responded by flaring brighter. The forest felt closer, not hostile, aware. Myra staggered deeper, breath tearing from her chest in ragged bursts. Her vision tunneled, dark creeping in from the edges as exhaustion finally claimed what pride could not. She tripped again. This time she didn't get back up. Her body collapsed against the base of a massive oak, snow cushioning the fall, her limbs refusing to obey no matter how fiercely she commanded them to move. "I'm not weak," she murmured hoarsely to the empty woods. "I just didn't want to be feared." Her wrist burned hot enough to sting. Light spilled between her fingers. Golden, soft, alive. The snow around her melted in a small, impossible circle, steam curling upward into the frigid air. Myra stared in disbelief, fear finally eclipsed by awe. She felt it then. A presence. Not the pack's, not the storm, something deeper, older, stretching through root and soil and shadow, awakening to the warmth of her mark like a sleeping giant stirred by a heartbeat. From somewhere far beyond the trees, a howl rose. Not one, several. Myra closed her eyes as the darkness pulled her under. The last thing she felt, the forest bending closer around her, as if she were no longer being cast out, but being called home. Myra woke inside a heartbeat that wasn't hers. It pulsed through the frozen ground beneath her back, steady and patient, carrying warmth in waves that wrapped around her like breath. For a moment she thought she was still dreaming, caught somewhere between snow and darkness, until her fingers brushed something thick and coarse. Fur. Her eyes flew open. She lay in the center of a wide clearing, snow flattened into a shallow hollow around her. Massive bodies surrounded her in a deliberate circle, wolves, dozens of them pressed flank to flank, their fur dusted white with frost, their heads lifted in silent vigilance. They were not snarling. They were guarding. Myra's breath hitched painfully. She pushed herself upright, heart hammering, fear rising too late to be useful. At once, a low vibration rippled through the circle, not a growl, but a warning that resonated through bone more than air. "Stay." She froze. Across from her, the largest wolf in the ring lifted its head. Its fur was dark as wet stone, its eyes molten gold, mirroring the light that pulsed faintly from Myra's exposed wrist. "The mark." She gasped and clutched her arm to her chest, but it was too late to hide. The golden lines shone clearly now, the symbol no longer dormant, the skin around it warm and faintly luminous. The dark wolf stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, it lowered its massive head until its brow hovered inches from Myra's glowing wrist. And then it bowed. The entire circle followed. Myra's breath broke into a sound, halfway between a sob and a laugh. "No," she whispered, panic tangling with disbelief. "You don't understand. I don't command you." The wolves did not lift their heads. They waited. Her chest tightened. No one had ever waited for her before. No one had ever listened when she spoke in whispers. "What are you?" she asked the forest, the question tearing out of her with years of suppressed longing. "What did you do to me?" The mark pulsed warmly in response. Not with words, but with memory. Flashes surged behind her eyes, moonlight flooding ancient stone circles, wolves kneeling before figures who did not wear crowns, healers standing between warring packs, quiet hands glowing gold as wounds closed and rage softened. Not rulers. Anchors. Myra pressed trembling fingers to her lips. "They weren't alphas," she whispered. "They were something else." The dark wolf straightened and took a step back, creating space for her to rise. When she did, slowly, unsteadily, the wolves shifted, widening the circle just enough to let her stand without breaking the protective ring. Her legs shook, but they held. A sudden whine cut through the stillness. A young wolf limped into the clearing, its hind leg bent unnaturally, blood staining the snow beneath it. It collapsed near the edge of the circle, pain clouding its eyes. Myra moved without thinking. She knelt beside it, cloak falling open, her wrist blazing brighter with each breath. The wolf flinched as she reached out, but it did not pull away. Her palm hovered over the twisted limb. "I don't know how," she whispered, I've never. The mark answered. Warmth poured from her skin, not burning, not overwhelming, but guided. The golden light flowed into torn muscle and shattered bone, weaving through the damage like thread through cloth. The wolf cried out once. Then the pain vanished. Myra pulled her hand back with a gasp as the wolf stood, whole, uninjured, tail lifting hesitantly in wonder. The wolves howled. Not in challenge. In recognition. Myra stared at her hands, tears blurring the glowing lines beneath her skin. I was hiding this, she whispered. I was afraid of what it meant. The dark wolf stepped closer again, its eyes steady. The forest hummed, and in that sound, felt more than heard, Myra finally understood what she had been hiding from. She was not weak. She was unclaimed. Not by a pack, not by a throne. By something older than both. Rumors do not walk. They run. They slipped through the mountain paths on the paws of scouts who could not forget what they had seen. They rode the wind in broken whispers, in howls that did not belong to any one pack, in the unease that made wolves lift their heads and listen to forests they had ignored for generations. By the second night after Myra's exile, Ashenfell no longer felt complete. The hunters returned empty-handed, not because prey was gone, but because they could not cross the forest edge without feeling watched. Patrols reported tracks too large to belong to any single pack, circling territory lines without ever crossing them. And always there was the same detail. Golden light. Alpha King Darius Stoneclaw dismissed the first report with a snort. Winter makes cowards imaginative, he said, pacing the council chamber. A frightened Omega does not become legend overnight. But his wolf was restless. It prowled beneath his skin with unfamiliar agitation, snapping at instincts that had once been silent. The land bond, his tie to Ashenfell, felt strained, like a thread pulled too tight. A scout entered before dawn, breath steaming, eyes too wide. There are wolves gathering in the frostwood, the scout said. Not fighting, waiting. Darius stopped pacing. How many? He demanded. The scout swallowed. I couldn't count them all. Meanwhile, in the forest clearing, Myra knelt beside a fire she had not built. The wolves had brought burning branches from lightning-split trees, arranged them around a shallow pit she didn't remember digging. Warmth radiated outward, chasing the frost from her fingers as she tried to process the way the forest now bent toward her will without her ever asking it to. She did not command. She listened. More wolves arrived as the hours passed, rogues with scars carved by too many winters, small packs that had lost territory, lone alphas whose authority had outlived their followers. They stopped at the edge of the clearing and bowed. Not to her power, to her presence. Myra felt the weight of it settling slowly, an invisible mantle that had nothing to do with dominance. It was trust, expectation, relief. She healed where she could, her mark glowing softly with each touch, careful not to push beyond the warmth that felt right. Every act of healing sent a ripple outward, through soil, through root, through memory. Back in Ashenfell, the elders convened in uneasy silence. The carvings, Elder Mara whispered finally, the ones in the lower vaults. Darius stiffened. Legends. Warnings, she corrected. We have not seen the moon's anchor in generations. Darius felt something cold settle in his gut. They descended into the stone vault beneath the keep, torches flickering over walls etched with symbols older than the pack itself. Circles of wolves around a central figure, hands glowing gold, alphas kneeling not in submission but in acknowledgement. When the quiet one is cast aside, Elder Mara read aloud, her voice trembling, the forest will reclaim its balance. Darius stared at the carving that mirrored the scout's words too closely for comfort. Golden light. A wolf bowed. An omega standing where kings once stood. Myra. He remembered her eyes, not angry, not pleading, only tired. I called her weak, Darius whispered. Mara did not look away. You called her dangerous and never asked why she hid. Outside the keep, a distant howl rose. Not a challenge. A summons. And for the first time since his reign began, Alpha King Darius Stoneclaw felt the foundation of his power shift beneath his feet. They had not cast out a burden. They had exiled the one thing the forest had chosen to answer. Darius Stoneclaw did not announce his departure. He left Ashenfell before dawn, the sky still bruised with night, snow crunching beneath his boots in the empty courtyard. No horns sounded. No warriors followed. He carried no blade, no banner, only the weight of a truth he could no longer outrun. The forest received him in silence. The moment he crossed the boundary stones, the wind died. Sound softened, as if swallowed by layers of bark and shadow. His wolf paced uneasily beneath his skin, every instinct screaming that he was no longer sovereign here. He felt her before he saw her. A warmth tugged at something he had buried deep, an echo of balance, of purpose that had nothing to do with dominance. Then he stepped into the clearing. And stopped. Wolves filled it. Not scattered, not hunting. They stood shoulder to shoulder in a wide, living ring, scarred rogues beside towering alphas, lone hunters beside small family packs. Their eyes reflected firelight and moonlight together, creating a horizon of quiet power. They did not snarl. They did not lunge. They simply blocked his path. Darius took one step forward. The wolves moved as one, tightening the circle. He stopped. Slowly, so slowly his knees protested, Darius lowered himself to the frozen ground. Snow soaked into his trousers, cold bit into his skin. He welcomed it. "I was wrong," he said hoarsely. "I measured worth by noise." The wolves did not move. From their center, Myra stepped forward. She did not wear regalia. Her cloak was still mended in places, her boots still worn thin, but golden light flowed beneath her wrist and up her forearm, steady and alive. She looked calm, not triumphant, not broken. "You called me weak," she said softly. Darius bowed his head lower. "Yes." "You sent me to die," she continued, "because I did not roar." His throat tightened. "Yes." Silver gold light pulsed faintly between them. "I did not hide because I wanted power," Myra said. "I hid because power is never given without a price." The wolves bowed. Darius's wolf whimpered inside him, recognition twisting painfully through his instincts. "I do not come to claim you," he whispered. "I come to acknowledge what I lost." Myra studied him for a long moment. Then she turned her gaze to the wolves, to the wounded who had been healed, to the rogues who now rested without fear. "You didn't lose me," she said quietly. "You lost what you refused to understand." Darius pressed his forehead to the snow. "I kneel," he said, "not as king, as wolf." And the forest accepted him. Darius Stoneclaw returned to Ashenfell at twilight. The gates opened slowly, iron groaning as if even the walls sensed something was different. He walked through the courtyard without crown or escort, snow clinging to the hem of his cloak, eyes fixed not on the keep, but on the pack gathering instinctively around him. "Summon everyone," he said quietly. Within the hour, Ashenfell stood assembled beneath the open sky. Elders took their stone seats. Warriors lined the courtyard with arms crossed but unease written across their faces. Omegas hovered at the edges, the way Myra always had, watching, silent, used to being unseen. Darius climbed the steps to the central dais and stopped where Myra had stood the night he cast her out. "This is not a trial," he said. "It is a confession." Silence fell. "I rejected Myra for being weak," he continued, voice carrying clearly through the cold air. "I called her useless because she did not fight, did not shift, did not roar." Murmurs rippled. "She was hiding something," Darius said. "Not treachery, balance." Gasps cut through the crowd. "The forest chose her," he said simply, "and I did not." An elder rose slowly. "The moon's anchor," she whispered, "the quiet ones from the carvings." Darius nodded, "Yes." Outside the walls, howls rose, not hostile, not chaotic, layered and calm. "They are gathering," a guard murmured. Darius knelt. "I will not command you to change," he said, "but I will." And Ashenfell began to listen. The howls arrived before she did. They rolled down the mountain slopes like thunder restrained only by discipline, echoing off stone and snow until Ashenfell vibrated with them. Guards rushed to the parapets, torches flaring in trembling hands as they peered beyond the gates. At first there was only darkness. Then eyes appeared. golden, pale blue, deep amber. Hundreds of them blinking open between the trees, reflecting moonlight like scattered constellations fallen to earth. Wolves stepped out from the forest. Not in attack, not in challenge. They moved with deliberate calm, filling the valley below Ashenfell in a wide arc that stretched farther than anyone could count. Alphas stood beside rogues, lone hunters beside family packs. There was no visible hierarchy, only presence. Inside the walls, fear rippled through the pack. "They're not hostile," someone whispered. "Then why are they here?" The answer came when the wolves parted. Myra walked forward. She was still small, still wrapped in a mended cloak, still the Omega they had once ignored. But the golden light beneath her wrist no longer hid. It flowed up her arm in faint, living lines, pulsing in time with the full moon overhead. Her steps left no prints in the snow. Every wolf bowed as she passed. Not because she commanded them, because they trusted her. Darius Stoneclaw stepped forward alone as the gates creaked open. He knelt before she crossed the threshold. "I see you," he said simply. Myra stopped just beyond the gates. Behind her the wolves halted, a silent sea waiting at her back. "I did not come to rule," she said quietly, her voice carrying through the courtyard without effort. "I came because you finally listened." She met the eyes of the Omegas first, the ones who had learned to shrink to survive. "You were never weak," she told them. "You were just unheard." The golden light flared gently across the stone beneath her feet. Then she turned back toward the forest. The wolves followed, and Ashenfell understood that rejecting what it did not understand had nearly cost it the only thing the forest had chosen to answer. They stopped using the word weak after that winter. Not because it vanished from memory, but because it no longer fit the shape of the world. The night Myra walked back into the forest was marked in Ashenfell's history as the night the mountains breathed differently. The wolves did not linger. They did not threaten or challenge. They simply followed the quiet Omega they had chosen, melting back into the trees as if they had never been there at all. Yet everything had changed. Darius Stoneclaw ruled differently from that day on. He spoke less. He listened more. Omegas were no longer dismissed as background noise, and healers were invited to councils they had once been barred from. The pack did not transform overnight, but it began to question the assumptions it had lived by for generations. And beyond the borders, Myra became something more than a story. She never took a throne. She never raised banners or claimed territory. She wandered where she was needed, deep forests, shattered borderlands, forgotten valleys where rogues and broken packs struggled to survive. Wolves followed her not in ranks, but in trust. They said she could quiet a battle by standing between the snarling alphas, her golden mark glowing softly as rage faded from their eyes. They said she healed wounds no one else could touch, not with force, but with presence. Most of all, they said she listened. When pups asked who she was, the elders did not call her queen or ruler. They said she was the one who had been hiding something the world forgot how to see. The forest did not keep Myra to itself. It carried her name the way rivers carry meltwater, quietly, inevitably, reshaping the world without ever announcing the work it was doing. At first it was only whispers that moved between packs, the kind dismissed as winter exaggerations or the superstitions of tired scouts. They spoke of a girl who healed without command, of wolves who knelt without being told, of a golden mark that glowed only when someone was suffering. Ashenfell had never been the center of the world, but its mistake became a lesson that traveled farther than any decree. Rogues carried it first, those who had nothing to lose by believing in something new. Scarred alphas who had outlived their followers spoke of meeting a quiet Omega who never challenged them yet somehow left them questioning every fight they had ever won. Then packs began to feel the change before they understood it. In the marshlands to the south, a drought drove rival packs to the same riverbank. Where bloodshed had once been inevitable, the wolves hesitated. The elders could not explain why. They only knew that none of their howls carried conviction anymore, as if some deeper instinct had begun to measure strength by something other than volume. Far to the east, a young healer named Sira stood before her council with shaking hands, refusing to be silent when a wounded beta was blamed for failing to defend the border. Her voice did not command, but the wolves around her leaned closer, not away. When the council relented, some swore they felt a warmth beneath their skin that had nothing to do with fire. The stories multiplied. A pack that once exiled its Omegas now sent them into council as mediators. A blood feud that had lasted decades ended after a single night spent listening instead of roaring. Pups born without early shifts were no longer hidden. They were watched carefully, gently, as if the world were waiting to see who they might become. Myra never lingered long enough to be named leader anywhere. She moved like a shadow that carried light, drawn not by borders but by need. She followed faint threads that tugged beneath her ribs, places where grief pooled too deeply, where fear had settled into the bones of a pack and refused to leave. Sometimes she arrived in time to heal. Other times she arrived only to listen. In a valley crushed between two mountain chains, she found a clan of wolves who had forgotten how to rest. They hunted without joy, fought without purpose, lived as if survival were the only language left to them. Myra did not heal anyone there. She sat. She listened. By dawn, the wolves had begun to speak to each other again. In another territory far north, she knelt beside a trembling Omega who had been hiding a child whose wolf would not surface. The pack stood nearby, their fear sharpened into accusation. Myra placed her glowing wrist against the child's chest, not to force awakening, but to soothe the panic that was choking it. "You are not late," she whispered to the child. "You are listening to something we forgot how to hear." The child did not shift, but the pack stayed, and the silence that followed was not rejection. It was patience. That was when Myra understood her legacy was not the mark itself. It was the permission. Permission for the quiet to exist without apology. Permission for healing to matter as much as hunting. Permission for wolves to stop pretending they were made only of teeth. Even Darius Stoneclaw felt it in Ashenfell. Months after her departure, he stood in the council chamber where he had once called Myra weak and realized no one spoke the same way anymore. Omegas did not linger at the edges. Betas argued with elders without fear, and when a young wolf collapsed during training, no one mocked him. They waited. That waiting spread. Across borders, across generations. By the time a decade had passed, the world barely remembered the exact words of Myra's exile. They remembered only the moment everything else stopped making sense. They remembered when wolves began to lean closer instead of shouting over one another. They remembered the winter when being quiet ceased to mean being invisible. And somewhere deep in the forests, moving without banners or followers, Myra continued to answer what the world no longer dared to ignore. Years later, when the packs tried to explain how everything had changed, they did not begin with Myra's name. They began with silence. They spoke of a time when the world itself had learned to pause, to hold its breath long enough to hear what had always been speaking beneath the noise of dominance. The elders struggled to put it into words. They had been raised to believe that power roared, that leadership was measured by how loudly one could command a room. Yet the years after Myra's exile had unraveled that belief thread by thread. In council circles carved from stone older than memory, wolves now waited before responding. Healers were no longer summoned only when blood was already soaking the ground. Omegas were invited to speak not because they were weak, but because they had learned to survive without the armor of authority. Myra watched these changes from the edges of the world. She never stayed long enough to become a symbol. She understood too well what symbols invited worship on one side, hatred on the other. So she remained a presence rather than a name, a soft disruption that left packs unsettled just enough to question what they had inherited. On the night of the longest winter, Myra stood once more at the borderlands where her caravan had died so many years ago. Snow fell in slow, careful spirals, each flake catching the faint gold of her glowing wrist before melting into the dark soil. She knelt and pressed her palm to the ground. The mark unfolded not as light but as memory. She felt the forest stir, not in command but in recognition. Roots shifted, water crept beneath ice, wolves miles away lifted their heads as if answering a question they had forgotten how to ask. Myra closed her eyes and finally allowed herself to understand the truth she had been hiding even from herself. She was never meant to rule. She was meant to remind. She was the echo of something the world had buried when it began crowning kings, The quiet agreement between land and wolf that survival was not enough if compassion was lost. Her gift was not healing flesh, though she could do that. It was healing forgetting. Across the territories, the next generation was already different. Pups born without early shifts were no longer treated like fractures in fate. They were watched gently, not pushed. Warriors who returned from battle shaking were not told to be stronger. They were asked what they had seen. Packs that once erased their weakest members now carried them like maps, reminders of paths not to repeat. No one wrote these changes into law. They did not need to. They lived in the way wolves stood closer when someone spoke softly. They lived in the way silence was no longer feared. Myra turned away from the borderlands and walked back into the forest, leaving only faint golden warmth in the snow where she had knelt. She did not look back. She did not need to. The world had finally discovered what she had been hiding all along. Not strength, not magic, but the courage to listen,